Welcome to the scoop then. We are so happy to see you. Super timely, very ad hoc session because yesterday the Commission published an implementing act that shines the light on the potential use of international credits in the context of CBAM. And there are so many questions around what it means, what are the potential consequences, and you're the man who has the answers. So, what has changed compared to our chat last time?
Great question, and I think this is the difficult thing with CBAM is we could probably do one of these episodes every month with how often this regime is changing, which for many of the exposed companies is probably one of the most difficult elements of this policy. It's anything but black and white. What's changed since we last spoke, specifically in the realm of carbon pricing and Article 9 of the EU CBAM, which allows for a deduction to happen if a cost has already been incurred for carbon, is we've received a good amount of clarity on what kind of costs and effective costs specifically would count, how those costs can be tracked, where the the accounting practices and the audits need to occur to ensure a company can prove that they have indeed paid that cost of carbon, and naturally with the probably the topic of today, more clarification on elements around carbon credits and Article 6 possibly being used to help those companies offset their CBAM liability if they've already been exposed to a regime that allows those carbon credits to be used.
Maybe just a procedural question kind of on where this stands. Because for like my recollection is in December, there was kind of a sentence in a commission document which opened up the space for international credits, which we discussed with you. Then, like 2 months ago or something, I think kind of a memo from the council leaked, which was in favor. And then last month, I think the position of the Envy committee in Parliament was strongly against it. And now this implementing act came out. Or is it a draft of the implementing act? And it's a draft of the implementing act. Okay.
Correct.
But just so I understand, the Parliament still has their position, right? So can we just understand the context in which this implementing act lives? Because it's far from a done deal, as far as I understand.
Yes. And for any specific expert opinion, it's always wonderful to source a lawyer. But in this realm, the way an implementing act for specifically this draft implementing act will have around 4 weeks during a consultation where the Commission will seek review and understand feedback from the market. That consultation closes in around early June. Now, once that consultation finishes, the Commission will then publish the official report of the Implementing Act. And interesting, you put up the European Parliament. I'd say, and I'm going to broad brush, there are many folks in the European Parliament who might not be as strongly favored for using Article 6 credits, not only for the CBAM, of course, but also for the EU ETS, as we've heard quite a lot about. And on the other side of the coin, you have member states and you have other regimes incorporating, including the European Commission, who are a bit more in favor. In this act, in this implementing act, this is the executive function of the European Union, and therefore it's the European Commission who's going to be able to provide and actually create these more minute elements about CBAM. So the European Parliament will give CBAM the thumbs up, right? What we saw in the trilogue discussions with Fit for 55 a few years ago. But it's actually the European Commission who's tasked with creating and actually executing on the orders that the European Parliament has created. And so it's kind of results in a song and dance, especially when you see larger policy developments such as the expansion of CBAM. Now that was of course happening back on December 17th when we last spoke, and that's where we have the trilogue discussions where you have the Council and the Parliament and the Commission come, of course. But for these smaller delegating and implementing acts, the European Commission itself can act accordingly on its own.
Yeah, it's the usual dance, I think, also between the institutions and deciding on the implementing acts and delegated acts from a specific primary legislation. And sometimes it's a real horse trading. You get 3 of this and 4 of that, or 5 of this and 5 of that. But in this case, we're talking about the implementing act where the Commission has way more power. So that's the reality.
And that's why it's wonderful to have podcasts like you guys, because let's be honest, managing and watching these policies can be a full-time job, and so there's almost a mini community that's spawned around how complex it is just to follow where these policies are, and so that's why it's wonderful to be back, of course, and hopefully provide a bit more clarity.
Yeah. What I wanted to explore was because we are looking at things from the carbon removal perspective and the impact it can have there, and so this implementing act mentions potential international credits via Article 6, but also domestic crediting. And for international credits, Article 6 rules will have to apply, so either 6.2 or 6.4. But for domestic carbon credits, there are no specific rules or eligibility criteria foreseen. So what does that mean?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, again, we've all been in this realm for long enough to have some horror stories of past CDM projects, and we appreciate sometimes not all carbon credits are equal, and that predominantly is the main concern a lot of the anti-Article 6 in carbon credit lobby groups have been saying. An allowance, and 1 ton of abated emissions is abated. It's binary, while avoided, for example, could be a bit more subjective, and that's where carbon credits do have tend to have some concerns in that realm. And what we're going to see likely is much more clarity on specifically what regimes and what carbon credits methodologies the Commission will be looking at in providing a thumbs up on. Again, you guys are more than familiar with most of the ETSs having their own specific kind of offsets that are allowed. Looking at everyone from South Korea to China to California and the WCA. And so, what they'll likely do is they'll take, a magnifying glass and look at these methodologies and these projects and likely decide on a one-by-one basis. I can dive a bit more into the legislation of what the Implementing Act is saying specifically. But one of the main takeaways I want to talk about right now is the puzzle will still missing a few pieces. And one of the pieces likely is a much more granular look at what carbon credits specifically would be looking to be given a thumbs up, and what would not.
Understand, because I always like making it specific with like country examples when we talk about the CBAM. And I've been looking, for example, recently I was looking quite a lot at Brazil, and Brazil, it's mainly steel that they're exporting to Europe, which would fall under the CBAM. Almost 90 or more than 90% of the kind of CBAM obligations would be in steel. But the ETS is very young, and it's actually just getting started, and it will be free and only ramping up, and only after 2030 people will really have to pay. So what would happen in Brazil, to take that example, if they were to allow both domestic credits and international credits? Because if the companies don't have to pay anything yet, like what would happen?
If they're not paying anything, there's no effective cost. So the biggest takeaway, I'll say from this podcast is, if you look on an exchange for what any of these allowances could be trading at, taking Brazil or taking South Korea, that's not what the effective cost is. That's just what the market's trading carbon. The effective cost is net of free allocation. And per your point, most of these new and non-incumbent ETSs, for the first few years, they're quite liberal with free allocation. And to be fair, that's what the European Commission did back in, that's why phase 1 and phase 2 of the EU ETS was, quite the learning lesson, to say the least. Because it's much better to oversupply in the beginning, learn your lesson, understand the baselines, and do the opposite and crush industry. And so, most of the ETSs we are seeing for the first few years, they will be incorporating a transitional phase or whatever they want to call it. And in that realm, the actual effective cost of carbon might actually be quite light, or in some cases, not at all. So therefore, they would not have any effective cost of carbon under CBAM, and they'd be fully exposed.
And is there any kind of criteria in either in this implementing act or in the upcoming secondary legislation on whether these credits that are being bought by these different operators, whether they're actually gonna use to meet this CBAM liability obligation, or like how is that link verified in practice, or I'm still a bit
They've
unclear about that.
The actual terminology is I'm going to quote the legislation, a quote unquote independent persons. So they've run out of verifying names and accredited verifiers. So now an independent person who has to be accredited by an EU, going down the same line, EU, a national body, accredited body, is going to be the one who will go and actually look and make sure that if so-and-so company in Turkey or China has not only bought their allowances and actually had to pay a effective cost of carbon, but let's say in this case also was allowed to procure offsets for that shortfall, that independent person would be the one verifying all of this. And so again, I'm full-time CBAM, and you should see my OneNote with all of these labels that we have in CBAM. But nevertheless, that is the design that the European Commission has created for this.
Okay, that leaves a lot of space for interpretation still. And then can you elaborate on that 10%? That again, I have to be fully honest, I didn't have time yet to look deeply into this, so that's why I'm looking to you. So they can be used. Yeah, explain the 10%.
So taking a step back, if I have a company in a jurisdiction that forces them to be in either a carbon tax, an emissions trading system, I'm either going to have to be, procuring, if there was an ETS, for example, carbon allowances, which are auctionable, or in some jurisdictions, I'll have the ability for some of that shortfall will be eligible to be, used to, to offset. I can procure offsets for that shortfall. So what, taking, let's say, some South Korea or China, or, there's many of these jurisdictions. Typically, that's between 5 and 10% of their total shortfall. So in this case, I can go and if I was a company exposed.
Sorry, just to interrupt you, that's what the ETS, the domestic ETS,
correct,
has already
domestic
foreseen.
ETS. Yep.
That's nothing to do with what the EU is saying. Okay.
Nothing to do with it. So if I'm looking at California, for example, which I believe is a 5% ability to shortfall. If I'm a power plant produces 1 million tons of carbon, and let's say I'm fully exposed for that 1 million tons under the methodology of for example, the California cap and trade, I can procure 50,000 offsets, which of course are going to be according to the California specific offsets they allowed under the ARB. And what CBAM is saying is, taking one step further, is if California, in this case, I'm picking because I came from California, I'll pick it up for a bit. If in this case California allows that power plant to procure international offsets, let's say under Article 6, only 10% of that entire shortfall that company has under CBAM. A PowerPoint doesn't really work here because, of course, power isn't being exported from California to the EU. Let's say steel in this case. 10% of their shortfall, so their total shortfall, their total exposure, could be used for, let's say, international Article 6 credits. And so what they're doing is they're trying to cap the ability for a company to use complete international credits, for example, for their CBAM liability. So that's where that 10% threshold comes in.
Just because I need to understand the maths here, and I think many in our audience will also be a bit confused because there's been different percentages thrown around now. So you mentioned, let's say California, you mentioned the 5% that they can use, right? And then you mentioned the 10%. Can you give a concrete example to explain how those two connect?
In this case, that California company would not even be able to reach that 10% because that mechanism caps them at 5. So that's where it's, yeah.
Okay, so this is we introduce a cap, but the domestic rules will determine the limit if it's lower than the cap.
There's only a very few. I could only think of a handful of ETSs that allow more than 10% of their exposure. So I mean, I think Turkey is flirting with 20%. Don't quote me on that one. And I think South Korea might be around either 10 to 15%. Most of the ETSs are floating between 5 and 10% in that realm. Yeah.
Okay, so the actual impact is smaller in that sense.
Correct. Yes.
That's an important calculation to bear in mind. Another thing that I saw coming up quite a bit towards the end of last year, when that sentence on international credits potentially being used came up, was a potential foul play with prices, kind of having deals between different stakeholders and just inflating the carbon credit prices to show that more is being paid than they're actually worth. And let's be fair, carbon credit prices can be very different depending on what you're buying.
That's one of the issues. It's not a standardized market, so price discovery
Yeah.
doesn't come there easily.
So are there any safeguards to mitigate that risk?
Goes back to that independent person or persons. If in your spot on, let's say I was a company, very large industrial, and let's say I wanted to inflate my cost of carbon paid already. Hypothetically, I could go and I could invest in a project, potentially even domestically, and then I could inflate, because let's say I'm a project developer, I control what that price gets sold at. So I could set it very high. Then my sister company, that steel company, could buy that project at that inflated cost, and they have an audit trail, and they can go to the commission, and they can say, well, hey, this is the price we paid. Here are all my receipts. And so I would say it would be up to the independent persons to do their due diligence in KYC. What safeguards and oversight that has, we don't know yet. But I think you're hitting the head on the nail there, which is the way. And I'm very honest with you. A lot of my clients, one of their first questions they always have is, how can we circumvent this thing? How can we get around it? How can I manage my costs? And so I'm pretty sure most companies, not there'll be companies exploring ways to more efficiently interact with CBAM.
That is eye-opening, I have to say. And
But
also,
to be fair, it's likely not going to be that simple. If I look at most of these ETSs that allow some of their shortfall to be offset, they're not just any random projects. They have very specific methodologies that would be eligible for that ETS. And so, I don't think, I hope it's not going to be the Wild West, and I hope there's going to be a lot of oversight. The way the European Commission has been approaching CBAM so far, it gives me optimism, because to a lot of the market's annoyance, they're not rushing into this. We're already quite late on this implementing act. We were supposed to have it before Q1 2026. I doubt that's because they're twiddling their thumbs. It's likely because they're, trying to make sure CBAM is watertight. The fact that they're giving us 4 weeks for this consultation, and the fact that they're really, and I speak with folks within DG TaxSuit, they're quite aware of this. And so, with things like this consultation, I can guarantee you that they will be very much concerned in considering this. This is the first time a country of this magnitude is ever really trying a CBAM. And so, of course, they're going to be stumbling a bit. Of course, there's going to be some issues. Of course, there's going to be possible ways you can circumvent it, but I think they're doing their best to try and manage it. But of course, the jury's still out there.
Can I ask again, one thing that confuses me is the kind of domestic credits versus Article 6 credits dimension. So if we take Korea, and Korea allows 10% domestic credits, and the local steel producer could buy up to 10% of the domestic credits to account for that. And how do I understand it? Is it that the CBAM is now saying you could also buy Article 6 credits, which I understand would be from abroad then, but what's the incentive? Like, why buying from abroad if you can just have domestic credits?
Good question. Likely it'll be up to the host jurisdiction. There could be supply difficulties with domestic projects. There could be a price arbitrage. People will be looking at that. There'll be different elements regarding about Article 6 specifically when it comes to various countries' NDCs that might be considered when it comes to a country maybe wanting someone to buy or not buy Article 6 credits for their CBAM obligation. I think it'll be up to the host country. Every host country, of course, is going to be viewing CBAM differently. What CBAM is saying is that it's giving the option. So it's giving the optionality for a country to, better manage how they want their own domestic industry to be interacting with this cost. And really, they have three ways to interact with that cost. Option number one, which is going to be again traditional ETS, traditional carbon tax. Option number two, which is within that mandatory regime, so that ETS or carbon tax, a portion of that, 10%, or for domestic, I don't believe there's a quantitative limit, but nevertheless, option number two is within that domestic ETS or carbon tax, a portion of that could be offsets, and then option number three is within that ETS, within that carbon tax, that mandatory regime, a portion, 10% in this case, could be international Article 6 credits. If that's complex, yes, it is. It's what 18 minutes into this podcast, and I think we're all still getting our heads around it, and it's not the lack of trying. This is one of the issues going back to what I said. It's CBAM is very complicated, and even this one implementing act is forcing three carbon experts to put their heads together and figure out what this could look like, how actually realistically will people be using this, and in some cases even mention how you can maybe even circumvent it and inflate the carbon cost a bit.
And you mentioned that this specific implementing act doesn't actually give us all the answers when it comes to the use of these international or domestic carbon credits. Are there other implementing or delegated acts in plans to watch out for that would add some of the missing elements?
Yeah, I mean, a good example of what we're missing right now. So you have there's broadly speaking, there's two ways you can have a deduction of a carbon tax or cost of carbon. Option number A is when you use actual emissions, and that's what we're talking about right now. The actual audit trail and actually making sure you can quantify specifically what you have paid. And you can only do that if you use actual emissions for CBAM. Option B is if you're using default values, you'll be given a default carbon price paid. So if you import a ton of steel from Turkey, the European Commission is going to assign Turkey a default carbon price. So we're going to look, and they're going to try and make it a bit more even across that jurisdiction. We don't know what that cost is, so there's various elements we're still waiting for, of course, and I'm sure we'll be getting more news hopefully soon.
What else? I have one last question to ask then, and that is, so you knew this implementing act was coming, right? You knew what's going to be the focus of it. Now that you have had time to read it, I mean, it was published yesterday. Was there something that surprised you in terms of what was in there or what wasn't in there, or it was all what was expected already?
Yeah, I think we were expecting the European Commission to incentivize ETSs and carbon taxes more than, let's say, offsets in Article 6, and so that's something that is definitely true. I mean, broadly speaking, one of the main goals of the CBAM is to incentivize and encourage European trading partners to incorporate a cost of carbon. And so the real question is, what kind of cost of carbon does the European Commission want them to be encouraging? And the simplest answer is a cost of carbon that as closely as possible mirrors the EU ETS. And so what we're seeing in these implementing acts is the European Commission trying to, with small subtle jobs, for example, this 10% quantitative limit for international credits, small pivots to try and incentivize a country to incorporate a cost of carbon that has a similar design and effect as the EU ETS. And so that's something that we expected, and it's something that we saw. And I would assume that something that we would continue to see in the future.
Just to be clear, there's no limit imposed by the EU on the domestic percentage.
Correct.
That strikes me as odd, because you mentioned, for example, some countries might go as high as 20%. And surely when it comes to the quality, why would we value the domestic credits so much higher than the international credits?
So that's again, it's a great question. I can't answer that because I'm not a minister of a government. Everyone has different priorities and interests. What I will say, we do speak with a lot of the governments, and more than anything, we speak with a lot of the large companies trying to lobby their governments, and what they're lobbying is for an effective cost of carbon or an ETS. And governments are quite keen on that, and the main reason is because the minister, the treasury, is going to keep the money in the coffers of that government. If that money is going to a domestic project developer, for example, Treasury doesn't necessarily have control of that money. And the reason Treasury wants control of that money is because they can take that money and they can subsidize their industry by helping them decarbonize, to therefore, in effect, be more competitive under the CBAM in Europe. And so, as much as there is no quantitative limit on domestic carbon credits under, again, to emphasize, a mandatory regime. This is something I probably should have emphasized earlier in this podcast. If you're still with us, it is a requirement. It's a requirement to have a mandatory regime. And that is the only way you can deduct a cost of carbon. It cannot be done voluntarily. So you cannot voluntarily procure offsets, for example, just to make that clear. And so under these mandatory regimes, of course, going back to my initial point to kind of land the plane here, it would likely incentivize the government to have an ETS or carbon tax to keep that revenue in their treasury, in their coffers, to use it how they want.
Because when I think about CDR, the impact that I see the biggest impact will be domestic, like on ETSs allowing domestic carbon credits. I can see how that makes sense for everyone involved. And if the CBAM recognizes that and allows that without limits, wow, that could have a big impact on domestic supply. The international credits, for me, that makes sense in countries that maybe don't have a lot of resources to do CDR. We see, for example, Japan looking a lot outside their own borders when it comes to offsets. And so that could be, I can see how that could apply. But I'm really surprised by the not limiting the domestic credits. That really strikes me.
So is there anything else we want to ask Dan, or shall we wrap it up?
I think we can wrap it up. This was great.
Yeah.
I guess maybe looking, Dan, how do you see the impact on carbon removal? Like, if you think about the audience of this podcast, like, what do you think?
The impact I see is it further substantiates that the voluntary carbon market and the voluntary market altogether is coming closer and joining up with compliance regimes. And so CBAM is one of many examples of this, where if you are a project developer or you're in the CDR in VCM space, if you can align yourself with a compliance demand, in my eyes, that's what CBAM is creating here, then the long-term ability there to create a revenue and have interest is going to increase significantly. And CBAM is just another substantiation of that correlation and alignment of the VCM and compliance markets.
Super interesting.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks for being available at very short notice. We learned a lot. I learned so much from this. I'm sure all the listeners will do.
Thanks, Dan. And be careful what you wish for. You said we might have you on once a month if there's that many developments in CBAM. So
it's always a pleasure to chat with you guys. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I will say, phenomenal questions as always. You guys know the market enough to really ask some good questions. And so lovely for me to be here.
Thanks.
You know it enough to answer them. Yeah. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. Until next time. Bye-bye.